Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I've been changing the title slightly, as you can see. I see the early modern East Indies instead of Indonesia because the geographical scope is a little bit larger. Yeah. Now, as we all know, the analytical study of slavery and coerced labor has been going forward by leaps and bounds in recent years with a steady stream of edited volume by Wing Campbell and others, which indicate that this field of coerced labor in the Indian Ocean world and Asia is no longer obscure or marginal in any sense that needs to be proven. And that has also enabled us to escape the so-called curse of the Atlantic that Richard Allen used to talk about. So meaning that the infamous slave traffic from Africa to the Americas has often served as a template against which we judge slaving on a global level. And that has been remedied, I think, through a lot of recent research by people like Richard Allen, Matthias van Rossum, and so on. And they have also shown that slavery is no sort of given system, but rather it's a social process that has taken a large number of forms. We have people like Joe Miller, Tony Reed, Wayne Campbell, etc., who have been active here. So what I'm doing here is, I would say, exploratory. I wouldn't say I present any ready-made results, but rather I try to open up some new avenues of investigation. And in this, I try to combine two things that are going on at the moment where I'm active. And the first is this project that Philip was mentioning, imperial expansion and intercultural diplomacy, treaty making in Southeast Asia around 1750 to 1920. We are sort of changing the time period a little bit here. So here you can see we are a bunch of people from various parts of the world who are cooperating in this. There you see a Javanese contract from the 19th century, by the way. Yeah, so that's one. And the other one is something I have been doing the last years about slavery, bondage, coerced labor in the eastern parts of what is today Indonesia and Timor-Leste, mapping trajectories of slavery and bondage, slave routes and zones of coerced labor in Eastern Maritime Southeast Asia, 1500 to 1900. And that has resulted in a few essays and articles in the past years. And by combining these two, I would argue then that slavery and coerced labor play a certain part in the extensive diplomatic activity that was conducted by early colonial powers, and especially then the Dutch in early modern maritime Asia. And this in turn can be related to changes that took place in terms of the human landscape and the natural landscape, ecology, since officially regulated deployment of enslaved labor would have affected the use of land and the exploitation of the natural resources. Yeah, so it would be an important task, I think, to analyze how treaties, contracts, agreements, compacts shaped local political realities, how they were shaped by intercultural relations, how they influenced imperialism in Southeast Asia in the so-called early modern period, so roughly between the 16th and 19th centuries. And especially with the establishment of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, we get a fine-tuned diplomatic network that wasn't there before. The Portuguese would not write treaties in that respect with non-Christian entities, polities, and the same with the Spanish. So what the VOC were doing in the course of the 17th century was something rather new, this very, very fine-tuned network and the writing of hundreds and hundreds of contracts. So these historical treaties, they are relevant for a lot of lasting issues concerning social, economic, political matters, sovereignty, national and regional land borders, maritime disputes, land ownership, control of natural resources and ecological issues, and then also the use of unfree manpower. And clauses in these diplomatic instruments that relate to the acquisition and allocation of enslaved labor come in here naturally in the contracts. So trade in enslaved people became important in the VOC possessions and areas of influence as a corollary of colonial processes, and access and deployment would then be dependent on the negotiations with the regional Asian polities and settlements. In large parts of especially Southeast Asia, we have insecure conditions. For much of the 17th century, slave raiding was common, especially in stateless or otherwise vulnerable areas, and that would result in widespread enslavement, allocation of slaves. That gave opportunities to European powers, especially here the Dutch, to reinforce or alter previously existing circuits of slave trade. And I think the 16th century is interesting here because this was the period of formation of the VOC empire, the Dutch early colonial empire, when this diplomatic network was built up by and by. They were concluded with polities of any size, from the huge Mughal empire to tiny villages and village clusters in islands like Nias and Ambon. And when I work with this material, I use the well-known source publication Corpus Diplomaticum Nederlando Indicum that was issued in 6 hefty volumes in the course of the 20th century. I used the digitized version, which is found at the Courts Foundation website, and did data sampling, identifying all passages from 1600 to 1700 that mentioned slaves, slaven, or serfs, lijfeigenen. So these two terms are used helter-skelter in the Dutch documents. And that slaves do loom large in the early modern colonial relations is clearly seen from the number of contracts that refer to them. And that's a total of 115 contracts and agreements of a grand total of 612 that the Dutch concluded with various Asian entities up to 1700, mostly but not exclusively from Southeast Asia. And here you can see how it looks like when you look at the geography. So about half of them are about Eastern Indonesia, and then in falling scale, Sumatra, Ceylon / South India, Java, and so on. So surprisingly little about Java and the Malay Peninsula, considering that the VOC were quite active there, but that's how it is for reasons that I will explain shortly. So Eastern Indonesia, I define that as the islands to the east of Bali and including Sulawesi. And interesting, large sections of this territory held limited economic interest for the VOC. Of course, we have the clove and nutmeg plantations in the Ambon and Banda Islands, but otherwise, yeah, it was often areas where the VOC would have very little economic opportunities. And we see that the contracts are often concluded with polities from which little or no profit could be expected. So we have a generally fragmented political landscape in the eastern part of the archipelago, and that made it necessary to approach the islands and even the village clusters by and by in order to keep rivals away that might have otherwise disturbed the appropriation of the spices in Maluku, the Malucus, and also sandalwood in Timor, which was quite important, and for that matter also access to slave labor. So I would mention an example here. I go to the Tanimbar Islands. Here you see a map of eastern Indonesia, and the Tanimbar Islands are to the far south. And they were stateless, a stateless area. The VOC signed a contract with some chiefs in Tanimbar in 1646, and we see here that there were things going on before the Dutch. The contract specifically mentions people from the seafaring Muslim polity Makassar in Sulawesi, and also fugitive seafarers who had escaped from the notorious Dutch genocide in Banda, who used the rhythm of the monsoon pattern to go to the south side of the main island, Yemdena, as you see here on the map, at the end of March. So in other words, shortly before the monsoon shift that would then enable them to return with the merchandise. And the contract that the Dutch concluded has a paragraph that specifically mentions slave trade here. I quote here, "We promise in the aforementioned manner, generally and individually, that we, the inhabitants of all these islands, shall not sell, trade, barter, or line any slaves, amber, turtle shell, manta skins, red and yellow color, or black ebony, or other merchandise to anyone in the world who might be there directly or indirectly under any guise, except to the upper merchant, under merchants, or assistants." So in other words, the Dutch guys. So yeah, poor mantas, I can say. Now, slaves are mentioned first here before the so-called exotic products such as amber and manta skins that strongly suggest the previous trade with the Muslim seafarers. But the passage also hints how the VOC was altering economy and environment in the larger region. So if you put this paragraph in context, it's rather interesting. So by forbidding the Tanimbarese people to trade with any other than the Dutch, who would anyway be rare visitors for logistic reasons, the VOC quite simply stymied inter-island exchange, or tried to do, I would say, and they favored a way of life that the Europeans much later would call traditional, even if VOC control slackened by and by. The enslaved people coming from Tanimbar would go to Banda, where they worked on the nutmeg plantations. And we have some proto-demographic data from Banda from the 17th century that show that lots and lots of slaves came from the southern Maluku, Papua, New Guinea then, and the Timor Islands, and they were used then to maintain the plantations, which significantly changed the natural environment of Maluku, or parts of Maluku. Thus, the contracts with such minor island societies and the slave paragraphs do tell a lot about how this was part of a larger, even global mercantilist apparatus project that in the end gave the VOC some 15% of its yield in the Netherlands, a lot of money. But then we may ask, were there any doubts among Asian elites to yield their manpower to be enslaved? Some polities which were approached by the VC and wrote contracts, yes, they did see the downside of the changes in the human environment that a large outflow of coerced labor might bring. So we have cases from Arakan in 1643 and Jinji in Tamil Nadu in South India. I may quote a note that was appended to the contract that the Dutch wrote. The commissioners also asked the Nayak, the ruler in Jinji, to buy 800 to 1,000 slaves each year as before, which was plainly refused. And they got the answer that this is not only very disgraceful to sell people, but also counted as a great sin before their gods. And likewise, the renowned Maratha ruler Shivaji, some decades later, emphasized in an agreement with the Dutch that he would not tolerate any slave trade. If the Dutch tried to take in slaves, despite the prohibition, then Shivaji's men would forcibly stop them to do so. This is rather uncommon in the diplomatic records, this denial of slaving, but it is there long before William Wilberforce and the abolitionists around 1800. So it corresponds a little bit with what we heard yesterday in one of the lectures. Now, what were the purposes then of these slave clauses? Well, we have restitution of fugitive slaves. That accounts for a lot. I will mention that later. Regulation of slave trade, also quite a lot. Slaves as fine and tribute, also some, and less about how somebody is turned into a slave and prohibition about slaving and stipulation of tolls. But a lot of restitution of fugitives and regulation of slave trade is around here. And 31 instruments then have clauses that do regulate slave trade. And not surprisingly, most of these are concluded with Eastern Indonesian elites, but none at all with the kingdoms of Java or Borneo or the Malay world. And that has to do, I think, with large parts of the population in Eastern Indonesia being neither Muslim or Christian, but rather belonging to local religious systems, and therefore slaving would be less objectionable. Apart from that, these societies also were vulnerable, politically rather fragmented. It's also significant that the Western polities of Indonesia that do inscribe slave trade in the contracts were villages in Nias, the red spot that you see on the map to the right, and the ports of West Sumatra with non-Muslim hinterlands. In the Nias contracts in 1693, it's mentioned that the merchandise of the island mostly consists of slaves and foodstuff in that order, which must henceforth be sold exclusively to the Dutch, who were moreover exempted from tolls. And this in turn can be explained through the historical experiences of the Nias chiefs. Slavers from the Aceh kingdom were very active here, depleting manpower, sometimes in cooperation with local chiefs, and thus disturbing patterns of settlements and moods of production. So we see here again an ecological factor of it. And raiding would have its impact, obviously, on ecology. But we have seen that enslaved people performed work in the Moluccas at the spice plantations that changed the environment. But also we have the issue of depopulation that make people turn into new and less vulnerable forms of settlement. In the corpus of contracts, there are not so many, but there are 4 contracts where the Dutch expressly enjoin the other part to acquire new slaves and sale to the company, obviously via raiding. And all of these are in eastern Indonesia with a relatively fragmented political structure. We have one example with the consequences to this day that Western New Guinea belongs to Indonesia. In 1667, the VOC acknowledged the power of the Moluccan Sultanate Tidore over Papua on condition that the VOC could ask for slaves from that area when needed. So implicitly through raiding. Let me see. Yeah. And the slaving could also be combined with resource extraction. So we have some examples. For example, there were chiefs in Seram Laut in Maluku and Onin, which is situated in Papua, who undertook to collect slaves. And that was made in combination with the valuable masoi bark that was used for medical purposes, implicitly then from Papua, which would be picked up by Dutch ships. And similarly, we have a contract with Solor, where the Soloris people vowed to go with the ships to various parts of the area and collect slaves, beeswax, and turtle shell in that order. So bad news for the bees, turtles, and trees, and the contracts implying entwinement of European indigenous slaving, and also consequences for this particular combination between slaving and the collecting of animals and forest products, loris, birds of paradise, etc. This resource extraction would have hard ecological consequences, although the sources are not always very generous with the details about it. Humans could also be payment for fines. Humans were very valuable. We can see that the VOC sometimes stipulate in the contracts that defeated populations would deliver lots of slaves. In Makassar, after the famous war in 1667, a veritable army would be turned over to the Dutch. 1,000 slaves, young, healthy, and adult, and together with the losses in the Dutch Makassar War and the following conflicts, that would have terrible social and economic consequences, leading to large seaborne migration to other parts of Indonesia. And the VOC sometimes also would force villages to lease slaves for a number of years. That's also that was also a kind of fine. Yeah. Finally, then resistance. Is there any case of resistance in all this? And yes, I would say there is. If we take a look at the contracts and agreements, as many as 72 out of 115 contain clauses about slaves or serfs who escape and who are then wanted back. And these restitution clauses, they become a mainstay when political contracts are drawn up in the course of the 17th century. So there is a fear of runaway slaves joining Southeast Asian settlements and politics. It would weaken the social position of the Europeans. It might create hostile maroon communities, even maybe challenge the dominant position of the VOC, which did happen sometimes. Most famous, the Surapati rebellion in Java in the late 17th century. And in order to stymie this widespread maraudage that was taking place, the Dutch used a combination of carrots and sticks. Yeah, I think I'm approaching the conclusions here. And at this point of time in the early modern era, yeah, the contracts still usually had an element of reciprocity. When the Dutch were approaching Asian elites, there was at least some reciprocity here. It breathed a certain respect for the Asian part, something that didn't hinder the Dutch from trying to secure the main advantages. It's a historical discussion about this thing going on with Salia Belmessos and Martine van Ittersum and other scholars. Sometimes there's a distinction made between natural law, which is considered fine and just by all the parts, and positive law that comes in a little bit later, in later colonial history, where the stronger part, the colonial part, is dictating the clauses. The frequent references to slaves in the contracts hardly contain definitions of who was a slave and who was not. But for Asians as well as Europeans, heavily bonded manpower was a social category, although it was variable, which made mutual contractual understandings possible. There was a meeting ground here. Now, European slaving activities related to diplomatic forays, did they make an ecological imprint on Asian societies? Yes, I think in a way it did. Interpolity agreements are, of course, common in Asian history, but the enormously fine-tuned system of contracts and agreements that the VOC achieved from Persia to Japan was unprecedented. The multitude of slave clauses then served to regulate the acquisition and deployment of slave labor, with consequences in South and Southeast Asia. We have mining activities in West Sumatra, plantations in Banda, etc., works undertaken in the string of port cities, all which changed the landscape through resource extraction and other economic activities. Depopulation and relocation to less vulnerable settlement patterns significantly changed the landscape, especially in Eastern Indonesia, although it has to be remembered that Asian groups were also involved in slaving. So all this has to be deepened, of course. I'm just in the beginning of this stuff, but I hope to combine a study of the contracts with, for example, Dagerister's reports about diplomatic negotiations where slaves are mentioned. This contracts might be terse-worded, unemotional, but I think they are one of several avenues to study unfreedom and environment in the Indian Ocean world. Thank you very much.